All right, welcome back everyone to my round 7 recap from the Reykjavik Open. This was by far my craziest game of the tournament, and I was playing against a player by the name of Tobias Becker from Germany, rated 2085. And as we're going to see in this game, I really wanted to win, and I took a lot of risks. The game started with a Sicilian. We went into an accelerated dragon, which is an opening I've been playing a bit more often recently, and especially against lower rated opponents, I found it to be a nice weapon to get more dynamic positions from early on. So my opponent played the Marazzi bind, which is c4. And from here, there's two main options for black. There's starting with bishop g7, and there's knight f6. And the moves are sometimes transposing, but there are some differences. And here I choose to start with knight f6, attacking the pawn on e4, and after knight to c3, I play pawn to d6. And the idea of delaying bishop g7 is I'm unleashing this bishop and essentially preventing bishop e3. If bishop e3 is played, that runs into knight g4. So white has to be a little bit careful with the move order. He started with pawn f3, which is very typical, essentially preparing bishop e3. And I keep following my preparation. I take, and bishop to g7. Now, one thing I want to note is going into this game, I didn't really have much specific preparation for my opponent. Really, all I knew is that he plays e4 and usually goes into open Sicilians. But by some miracle, I checked this variation specifically.
It's such a ridiculous miracle that I don't even remember why I checked it.
Before the game, because I had a very similar game about a month ago in Norway that followed the exact same moves, actually threw a couple of moves further after bishop e3, castle, queen d2, and then pawn a5, pawn b3. I had the same position against Grandmaster Kulatz at the Corgero chess tournament, and I recapped that game. I'll leave a link somewhere, maybe above or below. But in that game, I didn't know what to do, and I spent maybe 10 to 15 minutes in this position trying to figure things out. I forget exactly what I played in that game. I think I played bishop d7 with idea of bishop c6. But for this game, I had this position on my computer right before the round because I was checking to see what the improvement can be. And I knew the main line here is to play a4, so I blitzed it out in this position. And we're actually following a Carlsen-Caruana game. I believe Magnus was playing the white pieces. You can check here in the master's database. So many cars. I guess Carlsen was actually playing the black pieces. And we followed the game for a few more moves. I'll leave the opening book open. My opponent played b4. I played bishop to e6. Played rook to c1. So far, we're basically playing like the top players in the world. And then I played pawn a3, which deviates from the Caruana Carlsen game. I think I just forgot my specific prep. Even though I had looked at the game shortly before the round, I wasn't sure between a3 and knight d7. I believe knight d7 is the main move here. Yeah, this is what was played in the Caruana Carlsen game. And then that game went a different route where eventually Fabiano went for the kingside attack with the h-pawn thrust. But as we're going to see in my game, we took a slightly different strategy. And I started with a3. And my opponent actually just tried to punish this move right away and maybe make me regret playing a3 before knight d7. My opponent here played knight to b5, which I think is a very nice move for white, because not only does it pressure my a3 pawn, which is a potential weakness, even though I'm trying to use it as a strength on the queen side. But there's also ideas for white of playing knight d4 and hitting my bishop on e6, which is just more of a target than really any useful piece, because c4 is now very well defended. And the move that I ended up playing in response was queen d7, understanding the fact that I'm likely gonna concede the bishop pair if white goes for the knight d4 in the trade, but then at least my queen can take back and I can avoid this kind of ugly pawn structure. And my plan with queen d7 was to put the rook on c8 and just try and have the best squares as possible for my pieces. So the game continues from here. Bishop e2, rook c8, and then here my opponent castled, and I was actually more scared of this move knight d4, after which I wasn't sure what was I gonna play, just because black feels a little bit stuck here. And sometimes this is a problem as black playing against a Marazzi bind. White's controlling so much space, and it's really hard to maneuver the pieces when you're just so cramped. And I would have felt very claustrophobic in this position. I think I was planning knight e8 and like allowing this, but maybe getting some eventual knight c7 and maybe b5, or maybe getting the knight to e6 someday. But I didn't have to worry about that. My opponent did castle, and then I was able to play queen e8. So I'm operating with less space, but trying to make the most of it. With queen e8, I give the bishop a square to retreat. And I also have ideas with the queen, which we're going to see very soon. So game continues, rook d1, bishop d7, hitting the knight. Knight moves to d4. And then I spent a long time before playing my next move, bishop a4. And I'll admit that I was very tempted after my opponent responded with rook e1. I was really tempted to just go back to d7 and offer a draw, because I really didn't like my position. And I thought maybe this would be one peaceful way of just ending the game with some repetition. But then I decided, instead of repeating, I have just a better square for the bishop rather than going back to d7. The move I liked the most was bishop c6. So I avoided repetition. I did not offer a draw. I'm still trying to create some chances. And the point of bishop to c6 is eventually I want to play b6 and bishop b7 and just have a more stable home for the bishop where it's not in the way of potential knight d7 and knight e5 maneuvers. So my opponent plays bishop f1, kind of a waiting move, but maybe preparing queen f2. I play pawn b6, queen f2 was played, and then I play knight d7. So this is a very typical move in Accelerated Dragon and Mainline Dragon. The knight helps unleash the bishop, and in many cases I have ideas of playing knight e5, or if the b-pawn ever moves, I'd like to play knight c5 as well. And in this position, there's actually a really funny line that I'm a bit disappointed we didn't go into. But after the game, my opponent told me he also saw this funny line and he was scared of it. So I was really hoping that he would take, I would take, and then pawn b5. And at first it looks like white's winning a pawn, but I have a really cool move, rook c5, sacking the exchange, and after takes, I don't even get a pawn for it. White's just up a rook for a knight here, but I think there's full positional compensation because this bishop is just a terrible piece. I have ideas of bishop b2 and e5 and bishop d4, or maybe maneuver the knight to d4, and black is really just dominating the dark squares in this position. So sadly, we didn't go into that. I also should note that I don't have to play rook c5. I can also play rook c8. And if white takes the pawn, there's a line where white's queen gets stuck on b6. And this would also, I think, offer nice compensation for black. So instead of being materialistic and trying to win a pawn, my opponent played a simple move, rook b1. And he told me after the game that he knew that the rooks generally in Marazzi bind like to be on c1 and b1. And I think he's very correct in this regard. And there's also ideas now of black lifting both rooks to the third rank. Ideas of rook b3, rook c1, and rook c3, and really going after this a pawn, which for the time being only has one defender, rook on a8. So I realized that I kind of have to figure out a plan here. I started with bishop to b7, just not allowing black to ever take on c6. He responds with rook to c1, and here I took another kind of long think, trying to figure out what to do, because my bishops are decently happy. My knight, has one square on e5, but it doesn't really attack anything because c4 is defended. And then there was a move that came to mind which looked to be the most interesting. And that move involves the queen. And it seems like the queen can't really play a role in this position because it's just stuck behind my pieces. But there is a move to generate some plan, is the move queen to f8. And the idea of this move is essentially twofold, maybe even threefold. I have ideas of bishop h6, attempting to trade off white's best bishop and alleviate the pressure on this diagonal. There's also ideas of playing some bishop f6 or bishop e5 and then queen g7, creating a battery on the long diagonal. And then I said maybe threefold because there's another idea here which I don't think I was likely to go for, but there are potential positions where f5 can happen and the queen supports the pawn, and there's ways of trying to break down white's center or maybe get some space on the king side. But with f5, I always have to worry about knight e6, so it's not an immediate idea for black here. So after I played queen f8, my opponent pretty quickly responded with queen d2, simply preventing my idea with bishop h6. And then I play bishop to e5. So I'm essentially centralizing the bishop, and I want to bring my queen to g7. I also had ideas of eventually playing e6 and d5, which I thought is a nice way to try and break down the center. And if I start with e6 in this position, I was a little bit scared of knight to b5 attacking the d-pawn. So I figured it's not a bad idea to over-defend the d-pawn so I can hopefully get in this e6 move. So here my opponent plays rook b3, I play pawn e6, and this is where things are about to get really, really, really crazy. Because after knight b5, it seems like I'm losing a pawn, and I realize that I'm probably in trouble here, but at least I'm able to just create chaos in the position, and I'm just in time to play the move pawn to d5. And I played this, and my opponent took a long think, because there's just so much going on in this position. My pawn's attacked twice, it is defended once, there's options of taking with either pawn, and there's this alignment against the d-file, so my pawn is actually pinned on d5. There's also ideas of pawn f4 hitting the bishop, and there's tension on the c-file as well. So just so many things to address. And the move I was most scared of, which my opponent didn't play, was knight takes a3. And I wasn't sure what I was going to do against this move, because my knight is still loose on d7. I think I was going to play knight f6 and yeah, beat down a pawn, but maybe have some more pressure in the center. And I haven't had a chance to analyze extensively with the engine, so I really don't know what the true evaluation is here, but I'll be curious to do so. So instead of taking on a3, my opponent played bishop h6, which is another alternative here, hitting my queen, provoking queen e7, and then he plays pawn f4. And this is a very forcing continuation. My bishop has to move. I decided to move to b2, which is the only way to save my bishop and my pawn, except I'm not really saving either because white sacks on b2. I lose my bishop and pawn. And even though white is now down material, there's some nasty threats on the g7 square. Queen g7 is a mate threat. And the position looks really, really scary at first glance. But I do have a way to defend. I play pawn f6. And at this point, I should note that we were both getting pretty low on time. This was move 30, so we had 10 more moves to make until getting an extra half hour. And I think we were both hovering around maybe just less than 10 minutes, like 7-8 minutes per side. And here my opponent really keeps trying to move forward and get initiative and get compensation for being down the exchange. He plays pawn to e5, which makes the idea of knight d6 really terrifying, because this is a square I can't really contest. But when I saw this coming, I had an idea to get initiative by starting with taking, and after takes, I'm really the first one to start throwing punches here with the move queen to h4. And my opponent told me after the game that he missed this move. essentially hitting the bishop and delaying white's plan of knight d6. And white's forced to play a defensive move here. In the game, I was expecting bishop e3, after which maybe I have queen e5 hitting the bishop and pawn. So my opponent decided to play queen to d2, and then I snacked on e5 pawn. I figured I would allow knight d6 and just remove the support of d6. My opponent still goes in with the knight, and it's still just really, really chaotic because my rook and bishop are attacked. My knight is a loose piece. At the same time, there's a lot of ideas for me. Like I was trying to make ideas of knight g4 work or taking on c4. There's also pressure against a2. And ultimately, I decided not to move my bishop, not to move my rook, but play a very forcing counterattack. Rook takes a2, sacking back material. Now, I'm not sacrificing the whole rook because after queen a2, which was played, I'm able to take the bishop. And even though these things are still hanging, I'm hitting the rook on c1. And at this point, we were both falling below 5 minutes. And I don't think either of us had a super clear idea what was going on, but we had to react move by move. So my opponent played rook e1. I respond with knight g4, threatening mate. And I was excited when I saw this line from a distance because the most natural looking move for white is to play h3, hitting the knight. And now I have three things hanging, my knight, bishop, and rook. But there's a really, really nice move for black to counterattack in this position. If you want to try and find it, feel free to pause the video. But I can simply ignore all the threats and play queen f4, threatening mate on h2, also hitting the knight. And I believe this was simplify in black's favor after takes. If we count the pawns, it's 5-on-4, and only black would have winning chances here. So I was hoping to go into that, but that did not happen. Instead of playing h3, my opponent played the much stronger pawn to g3. And at first it looks like, how does this defend h2? But you have to see the whole board. The queen on a2 has a long distance relationship with this pawn, so taking on h2 does not work for me. And now I still have to deal with this fork, and my time was getting very low, and I decided to go for a very insane line, starting with queen g7. Now, there's a lot going on here because the rook and bishop are still available for capture, but I'm very interested in just going after the white king. I really want to play queen d4 check. And to first show, white can't take the rook because after queen d4, the king will be forced to one of these squares, which is aligned with the bishop. And yeah, either square, I would take the pawn, and this is just about game over. Yeah, king h3, knight f2. Not quite mate. White has one legal move, but I'll be winning this position. So when I played queen g7, I thought I was being very clever. But then it still gets very tricky because white doesn't take my rook. White takes the bishop. And I didn't want to take back the knight because then my e6 pawn falls. Even a move like queen e2, hitting the knight and then later capturing on e6, I could be in a lot of trouble here. So after knight takes b7, I really have to go all out with my attack. I start with queen d4, and after king h1, I bring my rook in. And even though I'm down a piece, I have a lot of scary threats between knight f2 and rook f2. And it seemed really, really close to winning here. But white's still able to defend with the move queen to e2, essentially bringing the queen closer to the king side, hitting the pawn on e6. And at this point, we are on move 40. Actually, queen e2 was white's 40th move. So after this move, my opponent got an extra half hour. And I have one more move to make before I get more time. And the move I ended up playing was knight to f2, which is the most forcing move in the position. Now, after I had played this, I briefly regretted having not seriously considered pawn e5. And this is almost winning for black because there's an almost unstoppable threat of rook f2. Like, for example, bishop g2, rook f2, queen d1, rook d2 would be a winning position. Actually, I should play it out until mate, queen c1. I would get the famous queen sacrifice leading to smother mate. This would be a very satisfying win. But yeah, the reason why e5 actually doesn't work here is because there's this move pawn h3. And once I realized this, I was happy. I went for knight f2 rather than e5, because after pawn h3, rook f2 doesn't work due to queen g4. So I'm pretty sure knight f2 was the right decision. But after he plays king g2, I realized that I don't really have a great alternative other than just returning to g4. And I'm essentially offering repetition with this move. But because we got an extra half hour, he had a lot more time to think. And he took his time here, and he played the move queen takes e6, which at first looks really scary for black because my king is quite open. But after I played the move king h8, my king is actually really safe here because he doesn't have any checks on this diagonal thanks to my knight covering the e5 square. And from this position, I'm still threatening rook f2 or queen f2, and it seems still really, really scary for white. And he played one of the only defensive moves here, rook to e2. And then I go in with queen d1. And at this point, I thought I'm very, very close to winning because I'm threatening checkmate in one move, queen takes f1. And if he plays a natural-looking rook e1, then I have queen h3, and this is forced mate, regardless of where the king moves. King g1 runs into the eventual queen h2 mate, and if king h3, then I have knight f2 and queen h5 with checkmate. So white has to be really, really careful, and he found what I'm pretty sure is the only move to survive in this position, essentially to abandon the bishop and play king to h3. And I just lost internet connection. Oh no, my internet. Time to drink some more Icelandic water. Hey, we're reconnected. So after king h3, I still thought I was really close to winning. And when we got to this position, I calculated what seemed to be a really nice line is queen takes f1, king takes g4, queen f3 check, king h3 back, and then rook f5. And at first, it looks like I'm going to eventually deliver mate. And my initial calculation was after rook f5, there's a couple checks, queen e8, king g7, rook e7, king h6. And I thought if we get to this position, my king finds safety on h6. There's no queen f8 because my rook still controls f8. And rook h5 should be unstoppable. If he plays a move like rook e5, I have queen f1, king h4, g5, king g4, and I'm pretty sure there's mate there. Is there mate? Queen f3? Let me just play it out. I feel like I'm making a mess here with all these arrows. So I was calculating queen f1, here, 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 rook f5, queen e8, king g7, rook e7, okay, not a mouse slip, rook e7, king h6, threatening this, and after this, this. Oh no, I was calculating queen h5, not mating, but winning the rook on e5. And then there's this. Wait. Oh, I'm getting mated. Okay, we didn't go into that. But we didn't go into even the start of this variation, and let me show why. What happened? Yeah, so king g4, and the reason why I didn't play rook f5 here is actually something much simpler. White can give perpetual check after queen e8, king g7, queen e7, and if I move to h6, there's queen e3 forcing a queen trade. And at the very least, white has a draw. Maybe white can fight on in that other line, although I probably have some perpetual. So long story short, basically what happened is once we got to this position, I realized my winning ideas don't work with the eventual rook f5. So I decided to just repeat. And after king h3, I gave a check on h5. And very quickly, we agreed to a draw. given that the king can't go back to g1 because queen f1. And if I don't repeat, then I'm down a knight. And I would probably lose if I don't keep giving checks. So it was a long, crazy game. There's a lot of takeaways from this game. A lot I have to study and maybe check with the engine to see what opportunities were missed, what blunders were made. But it was really well fought. I think my opponent played very well and he was on the verge of winning. So I'm thankful to draw this. It did seem like I was close to winning, maybe at some point, but just couldn't find the way. So yeah, after this game, I had how many points? 4 out of 7. Now the tournament's actually over now. I'm recording this after the tournament's over, but I don't want to spoil anything. Do stay tuned for the final 2 recaps. I had some really, really fun games in the last 2 rounds. So what more to say? Keep liking, subscribing, commenting, and I'll see you guys soon.